Welcome back to the NextGen VC podcast. Today's guest is Jason Pitts, a principal at General Atlantic. Jen, Jason has taken a pretty unconventional path into venture, one that doesn't follow the typical playbook we often hear about in the industry. While it's a journey that does span science, business, and investing, it has a number of, I would say, quite interesting pivots along the way. In this conversation, we'll start by unpacking that path, how Jason found his way into neuroscience, how his thinking evolved over time, and how he ultimately became a venture capitalist. And then in the second half, we dive into how he approaches biotech investing today, what he looks for in companies, where he sees areas of opportunity, and why spaces like neuroscience are exciting opportunities for investment. So let's get into it. Jason, welcome to the NextGen VC podcast.
Welcome.
Pleasure to be here. I'm happy to be on with you. Mike, I very rarely get to talk to you in this context. We do so much work together, but it's nice to be here.
That's great. Thanks, Jason. As you mentioned, we have worked together for maybe 5 years now. And yet I think one of the things I found particularly fascinating about it is your path into science and venture investing. It's a nonlinear path, to say the least. Maybe you could start from the beginning. Where did you grow up, and how did you find your way into science?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up on the South Shore of Long Island. Both my parents were, kind of a working class upbringing. Neither one of my parents went to college. My father is a mechanic, and when I was a young child, my mom stayed at home to raise me and my sister. She started working later in my childhood, but it wasn't like an obvious and charted path for me to go to college or to go into science. Both my parents were very supportive of, my intellectual pursuits. And I would say, like, my father very much did not want me to be a mechanic. And so, from early on, both my mother and my father really, really fostered, scientific pursuits. And I gravitated to it even as a young child, medicine, how the body works. And that was something that I looked to continue developing. I had no real idea how to get into a good college, and what you did to do that. And, I would say when I was in middle school, high school, I thought, okay, yeah, I'm going to go to college, but whether or not it was going to be like a great college or whatever, who knows? As I got into high school, it's interesting because, like, this is like silly to admit, but like I didn't really even know you had to study for the SATs. So I ended up just like taking it. I thought it was like an IQ test, basically. And that led to me applying for college, and I applied to a decent range of colleges, but it actually was like a high school chemistry teacher that I had, Miss Coveney, who, shout out to her, who encouraged me to really push to apply to some very selective schools, and that led to me applying to Cornell, where I got in and I went, and I was neither one of my parents went to college, so that was it. I was officially in like uncharted territory from where they could like give me any guidance at that point.
So you got into Cornell with SAT scores based on no study.
Yeah, which I don't think you could do again. I feel like it's like more competitive now. You know what I mean? This was in the heyday of the early 2000s, when it was like a Wild West. And at Cornell, I originally came in. I thought I was going to be pre-med, and so I was a biology major. Within biology, you have to declare for like a subspecialty, it's like molecular biology, et cetera. And I went for neuroscience because I figured this is the area where there's like the most unknown. There's the most uncharted science, and it's the hardest problems, and it's the most difficult to study. So this is what I should do. And that was driven a little bit by, people in my family had like neurological disease. My grandmother died of Parkinson's. So there was an interest there. And then, seeing friends and others have struggles with like mental health issues, that also kind of drove me into that path. At Cornell, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do. It was loosely science, loosely medicine. And as I was going through that, I started gravitating more and more towards the scientific aspect. Like I wanted to like work on new problems, new questions, potentially go into the lab. And it was actually the reason I even got like exposure to biotech was just a fortunate accident that I happened to live next door to a person named Bart Emery, whose mother worked at Regeneron. And he talked about it a little bit. And the reason this became so salient to me is that I didn't really know what I had to do to set myself up to like even explore biotech. And it wasn't until I realized like others in the group who I think like probably knew what they were doing a little bit more than me were getting internships. And I was like, oh, is that something I should be doing? I should like figure this out. So I talked to him about it, and at the time, Regeneron was actually a struggling company. So when I reached out to some of the scientists at Regeneron that is like his mother connected me to, they were like, "Oh, do you actually want to be an intern here? That's wonderful." This was before ILEA and before Dupixent really made them take off, and so I was able to intern there for several years, and as luck would have it, when I graduated in 2008 into an absolutely incredible job market at the time, they were one of the only companies that was hiring because they were starting to hit that inflection point where some of their drugs were working. So I was able to go there and work and develop as a scientist. That convinced me that I wanted to continue to be a scientist, and that led me to grad school. And I can keep going on this like stem winder, but like that's how I ended up kind of like navigating from like my childhood to science and and Rockefeller University where I got my PhD. So
That's actually really fascinating. One of the things I think, just as a first generation person from your family, or at least your parents did not go to college, so they could not provide you with the feedback. This is what you have to do in college. When you go into Cornell, which is sort of a top tier university, did you find other people like you, or were you sort of like wondering, like, well, how everyone seemed so well prepared for college, and how did you navigate that, or did you just never think about that? You just had enough confidence in yourself, and you just plowed
I,
forward.
I I tried not to think about it too heavily. I was aware that it was well, like I'll put it this way: the friend group I had growing up, and actually the friend group I'm still quite close with, um, like most of them, their parents didn't go to college, so it wasn't like the social milieu I was in. And when I went to Cornell, it was like vast majority of the students there, their parents went to college. They were from upper income brackets. They knew what they wanted to do to like a specificity that I was not prepared for. Like the fact that people like knew that they wanted to, for example, like go into like mergers and acquisitions in an investment bank when they were like 18 was such a foreign concept to me. I was like, wow, I
I'm with
never,
you on that.
I never would have been able to predict that. And it actually drove a little bit of like a chip on my shoulder and some competitiveness when I was there. And I really wanted to like see if I could like outperform people in the classes that we were in.
Yeah,
And the biggest learning for me is was like the social and connectivity aspect and just like how much that can like open up opportunities for you over and above what just like pure performance on intellectual pursuits can give you. It really is like the world is relationship based. And like
Mm.
that was a big piece of like what Cornell taught me. And I think back to it, I'm like, it's not for like the accident that I was like friendly with this person that lived next to me in the dorm, whose mom was at Regeneron. I like might have been in a completely different career path. Right.
that's right.
And it really just to show you how those like the relationships can guide your life. And that was like the biggest learning for me. And I feel like a lot of the people that came in with backgrounds where their parents were kind of professionals and things like that came in with an appreciation of that like college was a place where you could really cultivate that network and open up opportunities for yourself. And that was something that I had to learn when I was in there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think continuing along your stochastic path into venture capital, like you said, you wonder, like, if you hadn't been next door to having a friend with a parent in Regeneron, what would you have been doing? Who knows? I mean, it's an interesting question. I remember you telling me, Jen and I, earlier on, about how you got into McKinsey, which I found also pretty
Yeah,
random.
it was. Yeah. Um, yeah, this is probably going to make me like sound like a not well thought out person, but sometimes people talk to me about how they can get into venture and investing, and I'm like, well, first you're going to need to not know at all what you want to do, and then, um, but I went to grad school at Rockefeller University. I selected Rockefeller because it was a premier scientific institution, and it was just a grad school, so um, I could really focus on the science. And when I came in there, I viewed it as the career path I wanted to do was go back and work as a scientist at a biotech, if not Regeneron, something like Regeneron. Thought that was a really exciting environment and wanted to return there and grow my career as that. I thought there was another potential career path as an academic, but even then I was aware of like what the odds are of you becoming an academic at a top tier institution. Um, but outside that, I thought like those were your two career paths as a PhD student, and it wasn't until like once again, as you described it, like almost accidental. In my like third year in grad school, I was like deep in a bunch of experiments. Our incubators got contaminated, so we were like down for experiments for a week while we like decontaminated everything. And it was just like during this period that like I got like an email that like, oh, this consulting firm is going to be on campus and there's going to be free lunch. So I decided like I was like, oh, okay, I'll go get a free lunch. I'll listen to what they have to say. And that was my like first exposure to consulting, even as a career path, and it's something I'd never considered ever before. I didn't even like know what consultants did before then. And it's like it's funny to admit, like I didn't even know I'd never even heard of McKinsey as a firm, which was I went back and like emailed some people I went to college with that were like in a business school and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh, do you know about this firm, McKinsey? And they were like, yes, of course you do. And I was like, oh, I was like, I kind of like turned. I was like, oh, I think I'll like maybe I'll throw my hat in the ring there. Like it was just like a casual thing. They're like, those are like, it's very competitive. It's very hard to get into. And what I saw there was an ability to work on a variety of problems, work on them at like a different strategic level, and put myself in a position where I could cultivate like breadth of learning and learn about all the different aspects of biotech and pharma that I was interested in, and that was appealing to me because at that point I was like midway through my PhD. I was starting to think through. I was like, well, I love the strategic aspect of this. I love digging into the science. I really like the almost like the desk work aspect of it. The going to the mouse room at like 6 in the morning to like check if the mice bred so that I could have embryos that were the right age and then do all of the experiments and things like that. Aspect of it was like a little bit less appealing to me long term. But I knew I wanted to stay involved with science, and McKinsey and consulting broadly seemed like a path that could open that up. And I kind of became like enamored with what it could be, and I started talking to people that were working at McKinsey, learning more about it. And then I actually like set up a little consulting club at Rockefeller, which like people may not be familiar with Rockefeller, but at any given time, there's fewer than 100 students total at Rockefeller. So there's not, but there were enough of them that were interested in this that we like were able to form a club, and we pulled in like Weill Cornell and MSK students, one of some Kettering students as well.
Oh, cool.
And that led to me ultimately going there. But it's just being like open to being like surprised by like, oh, there's like different paths I could take, and I should think about this and keep myself open to it. Yeah.
What
Yeah,
was something that was a relevant factor in ultimately deciding to take that job that you think would be helpful for someone who's in graduate school considering their opportunities?
Yeah. It's interesting because I talked to some people that they were like, well, I could never leave the bench because then I could never come back, right? And I know there are some people that think that, but actually there were a few people I know that went to McKinsey, decided, you know what, I actually really love science and would like to go back, and they did. And there's a professor at Rockefeller now who was a McKinsey consultant for a little bit, and then decided he wanted to come back and be a postdoc and a professor. But I think the key thing is to think about the types of problems that you want to work on, because you know science offers you, and lab science offers you something that like so few careers work on, which is like you're been working on an extremely tough problem right at the forefront of human knowledge, and you are going to work on that with a level of focus over a level of time of years and years that that is not going to happen at other businesses. And if that's something where you're like, that type of work is all you could ever imagine yourself doing, you should absolutely continue with science and like explore all the avenues that you can pursue there. If you're a little bit like me and you think I really do love science and want to be involved with it, but I would like a breadth of questions and problems to work on, and also integrate like a time bound component, right? Like that is the piece that you learn at a place like McKinsey that you wouldn't get in a scientific training, which is that like there's a strategic, a business, and a financial aspect to this that puts time pressure on these decisions. Being able to integrate that into your decision making, if that is something that appeals to you, then going to a place like McKinsey, I think makes a lot of sense, where you could pick up new skills and get exposure to just the full set of considerations that happen between taking something from the lab into human beings as a medicine.
And how would you compare that to your job now? What are the types of problems that you're thinking about as a venture capitalist that is different from consulting?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Like I would think about it on like two aspects. Like there's the level of depth you go to with the science, and the level of ownership you have of an individual problem. And so like when you're in the lab, I would say the level of depth on science is maximal,
Mhm.
and the level of ownership of the problem is maximal. Like this is what you're working on. You're going to work on this for years. It is like a marriage to this question, and you are going to become the world's expert on it. And I just realized this, I accidentally put this into like a 2x2 matrix, which is which is like what you do at McKinsey. On the other, I would say McKinsey is a little bit on the other side, where the ultimate outcome of a McKinsey project is a recommendation, but you're not owning and implementing those recommendations necessarily. McKinsey does do some of that follow-on work, but on average, that's not what you're doing. And very few people are hiring McKinsey to do like primary literature research. That's like not what you hire McKinsey for. Like you do more global strategic type of questions. And so that's the other side of the spectrum. What I find kind of like thrilling about investing is that it really is in that middle ground. So like I actually read more papers now than I did when I did PhD, but it's on a much more broader array of questions and problems. And although we work on a portfolio of opportunities, um, so you can't just have like one company or one question that you're working on. We do have long-term relationships and ownership there. Once you make an investment to a company, especially at a place like General Atlantic, where we could be on like a board seat, you could be taking a board seat, you could really be sitting side by side with the entrepreneurs trying to craft things. There is a high level of ownership to that, and so like I
Mhm.
feel like it kind of fits in that happy medium between a lab scientist and a consultant that I've been doing it for almost a decade now, and it's definitely been the right choice for me between those two poles.
For sure. And not only as an owner, but sitting on those boards, you also have direct liability, right? Direct duties and liabilities.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's a differing level than being an outside consultant to just say, "Hey, here's what we think, but you go and make a decision and live with
And
it."
there's an objectivity to investing that occurs, because at the end of the day, the investment will work or it won't. The trial will work or it won't, and you have to make judgment calls. and, back teams and support teams that are going to execute on a plan. But, you're ultimately, you're either right or you're wrong. So there is a level of ownership there that it's inescapable. Once again, I like that aspect of it, that there is like almost like an objective scoreboard of how right or wrong you were. But that can definitely be something that's like daunting to people as they consider their career path.
So, Jason, one of the things that sort of strikes me is, would you have done anything different than your stochastic path into investing? Is this stochastic path, or this seemingly random path of accidents, made you the investor that you are today? I mean, looking back, would you have changed anything, or is it
Yeah.
just the way this is the right path?
Yeah, it's funny because like like sometimes people ask that question, like if you could go back to like your childhood with like the lessons now, like would you do that? And um like for me it's probably no. Um Setting aside the fact that I would be like the most like world weary child that has ever ever existed. The I I do think there's like an element um of chance and opportunity to charting your life path that's like hard to recapitulate a priori, right? Like it's hard to just say like this is exactly what I'm going to do with my life, or I can't imagine having done that. I do think that I would, even if I could go back and do it again, I would chart a similar course of keeping my eyes up to what opportunity might present itself and keeping myself open to different paths and not becoming so dependent on any one avenue that my life could go down. Um, I do think that could have led to a different place if I like if you did a simulation where I lived my life 100 times. I don't know how many times I would wind up as an investor, but I think I would have taken the same approach and probably found a similar degree of like satisfaction in where I ended up by um, following a similar process.
Well, let's finish the journey. Like, what ended up bringing you to General Atlantic? I think we had
Yeah.
last left off with you in McKinsey.
Yeah, so when I was at McKinsey, my plan was to stay at McKinsey. I was enjoying the work. I like the kind of like team room dynamic and working on problems collaboratively together and being able to go from problem to problem to problem. So I was about 2 years in to McKinsey, was about to make the jump to the next level there. It's kind of like very regimented. Um, and actually, I got an email from somebody I'd gotten to know in grad school, Sarah Bagat, who was at Sofanova at the time,
Mhm.
and she had actually done her PhD with a lad in Yale, Steve Stripmatter, who was like a friendly academic, like rival to my PhD advisor, who's like Mark Tessier-Levine, and so we would interact a little bit, and then Sarah and I had gotten to know each other during the grad school like interview process, and had stayed in touch because we were both interested in neuroscience, and then just by chance we happened to be in these labs that had fairly regular contact, and so she just emailed me one day and said, we're thinking about hiring somebody at Sopanova Investments. I think you could potentially be a good fit. We're in California. I'm not sure if you'd be open to moving out if you did get the role. And it actually hit me at like almost like a perfect time because you know at McKinsey, everything is like 2 year steps. So at every like 2 year step, you kind of take an evaluation of, do I want to stay and do the next step, or do I want to explore options outside of the firm? And then also my wife, who's also a scientist, was finishing up her PhD at the time. So I was like, well, this is like probably a window of geographic flexibility that we will not have again in a good amount of time because my wife is thinking about postdocs or going into an industry role or other things and so I had not really considered venture previously, but I learned a little bit about Sopanova, and I thought, well, I wasn't thinking about leaving the firm, but if I did leave the firm, this is the exact type of opportunity that I would leave for. So I should give it a shot. I should meet the people at the firm. I should interview. I should see where it goes. And so, my path into investing was like once again, very well thought out. I applied to exactly one firm. And, at the time, the partnership structure at Sofinova was Jim Healy, Mike Powell, and Anand Mehra were the GPs. I met them along with Alan Kolowick, who was a partner there at the time. And I thought, like, I should do this. This is, I would, if I didn't do this, I would like regret it. And I need to see what this job is like, and if I could do this. And so, I took that job and moved out to California, and my wife very graciously came out to California as well. And which ended up being, I think, good for her too, because she was able to get there's a much more vibrant, biotech ecosystem out here than there would be if we had stayed in New York.
That's a pretty
Amazing.
winding path. I think you mentioned that turning a little bit to neuroscience, one of the first investment opportunities that you participated in at Sofinova was Karuna Biosciences.
Yeah,
Tell us a little bit about Karuna and how that came onto your radar and what you found interesting about them.
yeah, it's interesting. Like, I hope Jim wouldn't. I don't think he would dispute this, but he might not remember it exactly the same way. But when I came in, we had a conversation, and he was like, "Oh, I know you're interested in neuroscience, and you have a PhD in neuroscience, and like Sarah has a PhD in neuroscience, but you know, neuroscience is really outside of the risk profile for Sofinova. Like they wanted, Jim and Mike and Anand had been very, very successful working on, I would say, primarily clinical stage opportunities with very tractable regulatory paths and preclinical data that was a little bit more predictive, or preclinical data or early stage clinical data that was a little bit more predictive. I'm like, you don't really have those things in psychiatry or neurodegeneration. And neurodegeneration was completely fallow for investment when I came in at the time. It's picking up now, which is interesting, but at the time it was fallow. And so he said, I just don't think we're going to be investing a lot in that space. So just to be clear to you. But I have to like like I do give Jim and the other partners a lot of credit. They were like open to being convinced that there could be opportunities where they didn't necessarily expect them. And there was like a culture there where they were open to ideas that came from anybody in the firm. I was an associate when I started talking to Jim about Karuna, and I also don't want to leave out like Harry Nissen, who was an executive partner there, who's like absolutely critical in us like cultivating the relationships, getting that across the line. But like, why were we able to do Karuna when when the firm had not typically done psychiatry investments? It was like a unique influence of factors, right? One, the bar for success at Karuna was this drug needs to work. It wasn't a like vibrant field of like there were a ton of competitors there. Most of the drug development had been one mechanism. There hadn't been a new mechanism for decades and decades. And it was well known what the drawbacks of the existing therapies were. You're often asking patients to make a trade-off between control of their disease and side effects that were very bothersome. Metabolic dysregulation, weight gain, heavy sedation, et cetera. And this drug had a chance to like uh, get around that. Now, why did we have confidence? It's Karuna was like a very brilliant combination of a drug that had been worked on at Lilly, where they had initially brought it into Alzheimer's and actually seen a benefit on psychosis symptoms in Alzheimer's patients. So there was a degree of clinical validation there, but it had an intolerable side effect profile. And I'll get to that in a second. The other piece of it was this drug xanomeline. There was a small trial in schizophrenia that had been run with very positive results. And normally you say like, okay, that's a small trial in psychiatry. That's not going to like necessarily reproduce. But the interesting fact was that Karuna had the individual patient data from that small phase 2 trial at the time. And if you just took all the individual patients and tracked out their disease scores over time, you didn't even need to know which patients were on drug to pick out which patients were on drug. It was just so obvious the effect that the drug was having, even in that small data set. And you combine that with Steve Paul as CEO, who's he's the former head of neuroscience at Lilly, had been successful with the Sage at the time, and then several other investments, just like a leading KOL in psychiatry, and who I didn't appreciate at the time, but have now come to immensely appreciate, Andrew Miller, the founder of Karuna, just like the level of rigor that he brought to that company made a confluence of factors that allowed us to invest there. And actually, we had to like claw into the round a little bit because it was basically closed at the time that we had started up our work, and we had to go like a little hat in hand to Steve Paul and Bob Nelson to like allow them to open up the round to let us come in, which was obviously like very thankful that that they did that.
Indeed, the rest is history for sure. Hey, I want to make sure we spend enough time on General Atlantic. Tell us, it's classically seen as a private equity fund.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about General Atlantic's focus on biotech investing, including things that you don't always associate with a private equity fund, such as company creation, and how you find your position, your role now at General Atlantic.
Yeah. So one thing I'll say is, and I remind people of this every day, we are growth equity, not private equity.
Noted.
And I do think there's like an important distinction there because, private equity is one business model, and growth equity, what GA really tries to do across sectors. So GA is a large platform, right? There's like 100 billion under management across several different vehicles within the main growth fund where I work in. I work on the team there. That's 65 to 70 billion-dollar piece of that whole, and that invests in tech, consumer, financial services, healthcare, which it can be like care provider, revenue generating, and then life sciences part of that. We work very closely with the healthcare team. It's a little bit different in that we can deploy significant amounts of capital into companies to really facilitate their transformation from early stage science into potentially commercial stage biotechs, and can support them along every step of the way. And there's not going to be a ceiling that we necessarily run into on our ability to have continued involvement with the company. So when we get involved with somebody, they might be in phase one, and we can very credibly say to them that as your company scales from a $300 million company to a $1 billion company to a $5 billion company to a $10 billion company, General Atlantic can be there at every step of the way and scale our commitment appropriately to support you along the whole journey. And that is actually what kind of convinced me to come over to General Atlantic from Sofinova, was that dynamic, the ability to do that as I saw the field evolving. It was Sofinova is a wonderful place, but you run into a little bit of a cap on how much you can deploy in a company and how long you can hold a position. General Atlantic, there's really no cap on either one of those things. Like there's always a cap, but it's much the parameters are much broader, and so it allowed me to have that level of like venture style involvement with the company, but follow the whole story into the public markets, into commercialization potentially, and just all the way through.
So, we record these in advance, and so by the time this is actually going to be posted, it will probably be 2 months from now. But right now, today, there was a big announcement with one of your portfolio companies, right? Seaport Therapeutics. They publicly filed for IPO. Hopefully, by the time this is published, they will have gone public. But I noticed that Seaport was also, started with Steve Paul as well. Like the Karuna team basically sold to BMS, right? And then immediately turn around and start a Seaport. Is that how you got involved? Can you talk a
Yeah,
little bit about?
so General Atlantic was not in the Series A of Seaport. We were in this. We led the Series B, but as you note, there are a lot of overlapping people in Seaport and Karuna. So had maintained a relationship with Steve Paul and with Daphne Zohar. Karuna actually came out of Pure Tech Health, which Daphne was the CEO of. So they originated and incubated Karuna initially, and had maintained those relationships. And actually, Karuna was an investment both at Sophronova and when I came over to General Atlantic to work on the team with Brett Sabar, our head of growth equity, our head of life sciences growth equity. He asked me like, what are the companies that you're the most excited about that you've ever worked on? I said Karuna, and Karuna was one of the first investments I did at General Atlantic as well.
That's
So
awesome.
at both firms, I was able to invest in the company and see the story through different stages. I knew I wanted to work with them again. There was like an approach beyond like the science and everything like that Karuna had, which was exceptional, and the original idea that Andrew Miller kind of brought forward of combining two drugs to make something that was like bigger than the sum of the whole, sum of the parts. It was really execution, and there was a degree of clinical rigor that they brought that increased the probability of success versus what I think like other psychiatry companies would normally have. In working with some of these individuals again, I think you get that same level of rigor and approach. And it has some elements of Karuna where you're taking mechanisms that have a degree of validation but have drawbacks. You're modifying them with a new technology that can fully unlock the capability that they would have for as new treatments. And you're bringing that level, that like Karuna style level of clinical rigor. And so when you add those things together, it it was like an obvious investment for me at the time.
For those folks who are, part of our listeners who are operators at, various biotech startups, like, can you peel back what you mean by clinical rigor? I think they would, you know, as an
Yeah.
investor, when you evaluate a company, what are some signs of clinical rigor?
So I think you can look at it on several different levels. Like one is how are they designing the trial to enrich for the patient population that is most likely to benefit from the therapy? Now, in some ways you can enrich for certain disease characteristics, certain biomarkers, other things like that. And I think that's really important. In psychiatry, you want to make sure that you have patients that have, that have the right set of characteristics where they fit the patient population that you feel is most likely to benefit. And that can be extremely variable. And you can actually run into problems with what are so-called like professional patients that go to multiple trials, or patients that might have a similar set of symptoms, but not the exact, psychiatric indication that you are looking to treat. And so doing heavy vetting of every single patient that goes into the trial is something that is absolutely essential. And, that was something that we saw at Karuna that you don't see at every single company, which was this like central vetting of every single patient that goes in the trial to make sure that they are an appropriate patient to be there. The other piece is the level of engagement at each site and ensuring continuous training, rigor, engaging with them if they're seeing anything unexpected, and coupling that with real-time analysis of blinded data that can help indicate if things are maybe not going in directions that you would expect. Even on a blinded level, you can see like, oh, patients, scores on scales that should be correlated or like diverging wildly. You need to make sure that we're training the site appropriately, that they're administering these assessments appropriately. And that a lot of that work is not glamorous, and it's not, it's not like, oh, we're integrating AI or something like that. It is traveling to the site, engaging with the investigators, really doing the day-to-day work. And I think like that is what it takes to ensure a high quality trial in some of these more challenging, psychiatry and neuroscience indications. And it it, it requires just a supreme level of commitment to get it right.
That makes sense. I've seen that in some of my clients as well. And so I guess maybe the take home lesson for early stage entrepreneurs is really showcasing an appreciation for how important that is. And maybe even in their business plan, budgeting for the appropriate resources, having, the right advisors on their clinical and medical advisory boards, right? Uh,
Yeah, and I think it requires a level of like commitment from investors and a level of confidence from the team sometimes to execute on strategies like that, because when you're doing that level of optimization, it might be the case that the trial takes a little bit longer to run
Mhm.
or requires a little bit more more resources, more additional employee engagement. Maybe you need a bigger clinops team, a bigger clinical team than people would just benchmark if they were looking at other companies. And like I think a critical thing to remember there is like a trial that takes an additional quarter to run makes you sad for one quarter. A trial that fails makes you sad forever. So
That's
um,
awesome.
I think that's the key learning there.
So are you seeing in the broader landscape i- investors really looking to run in the other direction, which is cutting budgets? Or are you seeing more folks going into the quality and investing deeply uh,
Yeah, I
in the
think
space that you're playing in? Yeah.
biotech emerged from like a very resource constrained place after there was a boom that coming into the pandemic into 2021, and then there was a real challenging period that the whole industry went through where capital was quite constrained, and I think that did lead to a thoughtfulness about where capital was being deployed, not necessarily a rush to cut budgets and lean everything out, but a push to prioritize things appropriately.
Mhm.
And so what I've seen investors do is instead of, saying like, we just need to cut the budget everywhere, it is, hey, we're spending budget on maybe 5 ideas. We need to pick the two that are the highest conviction and the highest probability of success and really get those right and commit our
Mhm.
dollars to that. And that has been a shift that like things were pulling in the other direction towards like breadth. And I would say that there's been a push now more towards a focus and a concentration that I think as overall, like as painful as it was for those couple of years, been helpful to the industry overall.
So to close this really fascinating conversation out, Jason, neuroscience, what do you see as the next great opportunity for investment in neuroscience? What really excites you about the field from an investment opportunity right now?
Um, so we just made an investment in a company called Corsana Biosciences. That was announced a couple of weeks ago, and this is it deploys a technology called brain shuttling to get amyloid beta antibody into the brain. Um, we are extremely excited about this company, both because we think brain shuttling technology will enable amyloid beta therapies. Now there are approved ones that do have an effect on Alzheimer's, which like people thought was an impossibility, I would say 5 or 6 years ago, but now is the case. But there's a lot of room to improve there, both in the depth of the effect that the therapies can have, and in the safety and administration of the therapies. So the I think that the key piece here is I do think that brain shuttle technology is going to open up a new era of opportunity in neuroscience drug development, starting with Alzheimer's, where they will take these therapies that are groundbreaking but are IV and have some safety baggage, potentially convert them into therapies that you could administer, at home subcutaneously with a much lower safety burden, at least based on preliminary data. That still has to play out fully in the clinic, and have the potential, which we hope will prove out and have some confidence will prove out, to have better efficacy profiles. And you're seeing this brain shuttle technology get brought into additional areas in neuroscience, whether that be enzyme replacement therapies. You have an approved one now from Denali Therapeutics that's allowing an enzyme replacement therapy that used to have to be delivered directly into the CNS, transfer it to something that can be delivered systemically.
Mhm.
Um, and it's going to unlock a lot of modalities that previously were hard to utilize in neuroscience, like siRNA and ASOs. to get more targeted genetic approaches. This type of shuttling technology, I think, is really going to unlock those within neuroscience. So if I had to pick one area, I would say it is shuttled, amyloid beta and Alzheimer's therapy specifically, but then more broadly, shuttling as a technology to unlock neuroscience indications.
Well, let's hope that for all of our sakes, that is successful.
Yes.
We really need more advancements in neuroscience.
Yeah, and
Well,
I
thank
think
you so
we're
much.
really at the early innings there. So it's going to be very, very exciting.
That's
Yeah.
great.
Jason, I'd love to ask you a question we often ask a lot of our guests, which is that what's one piece of advice that you would give to someone who would want to do what you do?
So I think like the most important thing to get into investing is to, look to find opportunities to demonstrate how you think about problems to the people at the firms. And that often comes with like doing some free work at the outset and cultivating those relationships. But then if you do get an opportunity to come into investing, I think particularly if you're evaluating multiple opportunities, the key thing for me and what will drive career satisfaction long term is finding an investment firm where the strategy and the setup is not necessarily fully cemented, like where the cement is not quite dry yet, and you have the ability and the path to exert an influence there. So that was very much the case when I came into General Atlantic. Life sciences was just starting up in the firm. Um, Brett Zabar had just come in to the seat and was there for less than a year when I came in, and was really like crafting the strategy, and it gave an opportunity to kind of co-create the destiny of the firm and the group with full buy-in from the broader firm. And those opportunities are rare, but if you can find firms where that is the case, where there's some plasticity to their thinking about how they're going to approach the field, approach problems, and where they're willing to take input from the full breadth of their team and incorporate their ideas, like that is what is going to really make the career sing for you.
Yeah, I could see that, especially as an investor, you want to have conviction, and then when you have that conviction, you want to be able to follow through on that, right? So you need to have an organization that's going to be able to support that. So that's really great advice. Thank you for that.
Jason, thanks very much for joining our podcast. We very much enjoyed that.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the NextGen VC podcast. We are sponsored by Wilson Sonsini, the premier life sciences law firm. We're also sponsored by Launch Bio, a nonprofit organization that focuses on building better biotechs by creating connections between entrepreneurs and investors. Thanks to AJ Machado for engineering and producing today's podcast, and Steve Prutzman for providing our theme music, which comes from his Passengers album. Please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platforms. And finally, let's all do great work out there.
This episode may feature current or former clients of Wilson Sonsini. This podcast is for general informational purposes and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on as legal advice. The information in this podcast is not tailored to a particularized situation or jurisdiction, may not reflect the current state of the law, and should not be considered a substitute for the advice of your own legal counsel. You should not consider this podcast an invitation to form an attorney-client relationship, and no attorney-client relationship is created by your use of this podcast. Wilson Sonsini disclaims all liability in respect to any actions taken or not taken based on the content of this podcast, and notes that prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. This podcast may be considered attorney advertising in certain jurisdictions.